The day my stepmother fired me from my own father's company, she did it with a smile. Not a nervous smile, not even a guilty one. The kind of smile you give someone when you've already won and you know it. She stood at the head of the conference table, his conference table, the one he'd bought at an auction in 2009 because he said solid oak never lied. And she slid a manila envelope across the polished surface toward me like she was doing me a favor. "We're restructuring," she said. "Your position is being eliminated." I remember staring at that envelope for a long moment. My name was typed on the front. Aubrey Weston. Not Aubrey, my stepdaughter. Not Aubrey, who built the accounting infrastructure of this company from a spreadsheet and a prayer. Just my name. Typed. Like I was a vendor being let go. My half-brother was sitting 2 chairs down. He didn't look at me once. My father started Weston Fabrication out of a garage in Dayton, Ohio when I was 4 years old. I know because there's a photo of me sitting on a workbench wearing safety goggles that were way too big for my face, and my dad is behind me laughing. My mother took that picture. She died when I was 7, and my dad kept that photo on his desk until the day he remarried. Then the photo moved to a box in the storage room. I was 14. Her name was Diane. She came with a son, my half-brother Kyle, who was 11 and already had her same way of walking into a room like he'd already calculated what was in it and whether it was useful to him. I tried to like Kyle. I really did. But there's a version of trying that looks a lot like tolerance, and I think we both knew that's what it was. My dad loved Diane. I could see it, even as a teenager, even when I resented every single thing about her. He'd been so quiet after my mom died, this big, capable man who suddenly didn't know what to do with his hands at dinner, and Diane made him laugh again, so I kept my mouth shut. I helped with the dishes. I shared my home. What I didn't do was share my father's business. That came later. That was mine. I graduated from Ohio State with a degree in accounting in 2012. My dad called me the morning my grades posted, and he was crying, not sobbing. Just that quiet leak that men of his generation do when they're proud and don't have language for it. He said, "Your mum would have framed every single transcript." I started at a small CPA firm in Columbus. I learned forensic accounting almost by accident. A senior partner pulled me into a fraud investigation on a manufacturing client, and something clicked. The way numbers tell the truth when people won't. The way a pattern of small, unremarkable transactions can add up to something enormous and deliberate. I was good at it. I got my CFE certification, Certified Examiner, by the time I was 28. My dad asked me to come back to Weston Fabrication in 2018. He'd grown the company to about 40 employees, $8 million in annual revenue, contracts with 3 regional automotive suppliers. He needed someone to restructure the financials, tighten the books, get them ready for a potential acquisition down the road. He said, "I want someone I trust completely." I moved back to Dayton. I took a pay cut from what I'd been making at the firm. I told myself it was temporary, that I'd help him get stable and then go back. I never went back. Because the company became mine too, not in the legal sense, not then, but in the way that matters, in the hours and the decisions and the relationships and the problems I solved at 11 p.m. on a Tuesday, because that's just what you do when it's your family's thing. Diane never touched the business while my dad was alive. She had her own life, her yoga studio, her lunch schedule, her friends. And Kyle, who'd bounced between half-started careers in his 20s, worked a loose, informal role in sales that never really produced much. My dad kept him on because he was Diane's son, and that was the deal that came with the marriage. I understood that. I didn't like it, but I understood. My dad got his diagnosis in early 2022. Pancreatic cancer, stage 3. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the next 14 months because I don't think I can do it justice, and because some grief is private even when the story around it isn't. What I'll say is this: I watched my father shrink. I watched a man who used to lift sheet metal at 4 in the morning become someone who needed help standing from a chair. And through all of it, I kept running the company. I kept showing up. because that's what he asked me to do and because it was the only thing I knew how to do that felt like it meant something. He died in April 2023. He was 61 years old. His will was read 3 weeks later. My dad wasn't a complicated man when it came to planning, but he was thorough. He'd worked with an estate attorney back in 2019 to set everything up, and I knew the broad strokes: his personal assets split between me and Diane, the house going to her with a right of residence, his retirement accounts with named beneficiaries. The business was to be transferred to me. 49% of shares outright, with first right of refusal on the remaining 51, which would go into a trust managed jointly until I could buy them out at a predetermined valuation formula. He told me this himself 3 months before he died. We sat in his hospital room and he explained every part of it. He said, "I want you to keep it going. You're the one who knows what it is." I said I would. What I didn't know, what none of us knew, was what Diane had been doing for the previous year. The first sign was small. So small, I almost explained it away. About 6 months before my dad died, I noticed some irregular payments coming out of the company's operating account. Small amounts, $2,400 here, $1,800 there, coded to a vendor I didn't recognize. I flagged it internally, asked the bookkeeper, got a vague answer about consulting services. I made a note to follow up. My dad was declining fast that month and I had 17 other fires going, and I told myself I'd circle back. I did not circle back. Not then, but I saved the file. After my dad died, when I was going through the company's books to prepare for the estate accounting, I pulled that file again. And what I found when I started pulling threads was not $2,400. It was $340,000 over 22 months, routed through 3 different vendor accounts, all of which traced back to a single LLC registered in Delaware in February 2022, 2 months after my dad's diagnosis. The LLC was registered to Diane's maiden name. I kept that information in a folder on my personal hard drive, and I did not tell a single person, because I'd been a fraud examiner. And I knew what you do when you find something like that. You don't confront, you document. You build the case until it's airtight, and then you let the professionals finish it. I hired a forensic accounting firm out of Cincinnati, not someone local, not someone who might know Diane through the country club circuit she ran in, and I gave them everything I had. I told them to look at the last 2 years, every account, every vendor, every disbursement. Meanwhile, I kept showing up to work. The termination came 8 weeks after my father's death. Diane called a board meeting, which was technically valid because she held a seat on the board as the surviving spouse, temporarily pending estate settlement. She brought in an attorney I'd never met. Kyle sat there looking at the table. The envelope slid across the wood. "Restructuring," she said. I asked what my severance would be. She told me there was no severance because my position had been at will and I had no written employment contract with the company, which was technically true because I'd worked under a handshake arrangement with my father that neither of us had ever thought to formalize. My hands were completely steady when I picked up the envelope. I said, "Okay." I left the building. I sat in my car for 11 minutes. Then I called my attorney. The next 4 months were the longest of my life. My attorney filed suit on multiple grounds: wrongful termination tied to the estate dispute, breach of fiduciary duty, and fraud. The forensic team had finished their work by then. The number they came back with was not $340,000. It was $612,000, and that was conservative. There were also questions about certain amendments to my father's buy-sell agreement, paperwork that had been submitted to his corporate attorney in the last 8 months of his life, when he was on significant pain medication and increasingly unable to manage complex decisions. Paperwork that appeared to reduce my right of first refusal window from 18 months to 60 days, and altered the valuation formula in a way that would have significantly discounted the company's worth. His corporate attorney, when subpoenaed, said he'd received those amendments by email from an address that was set up in my father's name, but that my father had never mentioned to him directly. He'd assumed it was routine. He'd processed them. 60 days after my father died, the window my father had originally given me would have closed. Diane had a buyer lined up. The company would have sold for $2.1 million under the altered valuation, roughly 40% below market. The buyer was a holding company. That holding company's registered agent was Kyle. The hearing was set for a Tuesday in February in Montgomery County. I wore a gray blazer and my grandmother's watch, a small thing, but I needed to feel like someone steady was with me. Diane arrived with her attorney and a woman I recognized as her friend and occasional business partner. Kyle sat behind them in the gallery. He looked thinner than I remembered. He didn't acknowledge me. My attorney had filed our evidence packet with the court 10 days prior. 243 pages, wire transfer records, vendor registration documents, email headers, the flagged amendments, and the metadata showing they'd been created on a device that had never been registered to my father. Testimony from his palliative care nurse about his cognitive state in the months those documents were signed. 243 pages. Diane's attorney opened by arguing that I had no standing, that as an at-will employee with no formal equity stake yet transferred, I was simply a former staff member with a grievance. He said the estate was being handled appropriately. He said my claims were the result of a grieving daughter who couldn't accept that her father had made different plans in his final months. That word, daughter. He said it like it was in quotation marks. Diane nodded along. I watched her from across the room. She looked confident. She had every reason to look confident. She'd spent 14 months building something she thought was bulletproof. My attorney stood up. She said, "Your Honor, we'd like to submit Exhibit 147, a forensic reconstruction of the device used to draft the amendment document submitted to Mr. Tier, Weston's corporate counsel." The judge looked at it. He was quiet for a moment. Then he looked up at Diane's attorney and he said, in the most even voice I've ever heard in my life, "Counselor, the metadata on these documents shows they were created and edited on a device registered to your client. Can you explain why your client would be drafting amendments to her husband's corporate agreements?" The room went very still. Diane's attorney said something about authorized assistance, about Mr. Weston having asked her to help with administrative tasks during his illness. The judge looked at him for a long moment. With a device that accessed the company's document management system 47 times in the 8 months before Mr. Weston's death, including 11 times after his treating physician documented that he lacked capacity for complex financial decisions. Diane's attorney did not have a clean answer for that. Diane, for the first time since I'd known her, said nothing at all. I want to tell you that I felt triumphant in that moment. I want to say there was some swell of music in my chest, some sense of finality. There wasn't. What I felt was tired. A deep, structural kind of tired that doesn't go away after a good night's sleep. I thought about my dad and his solid oak table and his safety goggles photo. I thought about how none of this is what he would have wanted. He would have wanted me and Diane to figure it out like adults. He would have hated a courtroom. But he also raised me to document everything. He used to say, "Aubrey, if it's not written down, it didn't happen." He was talking about shop orders and supplier confirmations and employee agreements. He wasn't talking about fraud. But the principle holds. The case didn't resolve that day. These things never do. Not in one hearing. But the judge ordered an immediate freeze on any pending sale of Weston Fabrication assets, and he referred the amendment documents to the county prosecutor's office for review. Diane's attorney requested a continuance. The judge granted a short one, but made clear he was not inclined toward further delays given the evidence before him. Kyle hired his own attorney 2 days later, separate from Diane's. I took that as a signal. In May, Diane agreed to a settlement. She returned $612,000 to the company, the full amount the forensic accountants had documented. She relinquished her temporary board seat. The fraudulent amendments were invalidated. My right of first refusal was restored to its original 18-month window at the original valuation formula. Kyle's situation went differently. Because he was the registered agent on the holding company that would have purchased the business at deflated value, the prosecutor's office had questions. I don't know the full outcome because that part wasn't my case, it was the state's. What I know is that he accepted a plea deal that involved restitution and 3 years of probation. I did not feel glad about that either. I felt something more complicated. Relief, maybe. And sadness for the version of things where none of this happened. I run Weston Fabrication now. I bought out the trust shares in October, 14 months after my father died, right within his original window. The company has 43 employees. We renewed 2 of our 3 automotive contracts and added a new one with a medical device manufacturer in Cleveland. Last quarter was the strongest in company history. There's a photo on my desk. It's the one from the garage, me in the oversized safety goggles, my dad behind me, laughing. I found it in the storage room box after Diane moved out of the house. The print was a little bent at one corner. I got it reframed. Some things take a long time to get back to where they were supposed to be. But if you do the work, and you keep the records, and you don't let anyone convince you that the truth is negotiable, they get there. My dad taught me that. He just didn't know he was teaching me in time for this. People ask me sometimes if I regret not confronting Diane sooner, not calling her out at the board meeting, not saying anything when she slid that envelope across my father's table with that smile. I don't, and it took me a long time to understand why I don't, because the instinct, when someone wrongs you that completely, is to want them to know that you know, to watch their face change in real time, to not let it go unanswered for a single day longer than necessary. I felt that. I won't pretend I sat in my car for those 11 minutes feeling calm and strategic. I was furious. I was grieving. I was 31 years old and I had just been fired from a company I'd rebuilt from the inside out by a woman who'd moved into my childhood home and spent the next decade waiting for my father to die. But I'd spent 6 years as a fraud examiner before any of this happened. And the one thing that work teaches you, the thing you see proven over and over again, is that anger is loud and evidence is quiet, and quiet always wins. Diane made a calculated decision. She started that LLC 2 months after my dad's diagnosis, when she thought the window was opening and no one was paying close enough attention. And she was almost right. The amounts were small at first. The vendor names were plausible. She'd watched me run those books for 5 years, and she understood just enough about how I worked to try to stay inside my blind spots. What she didn't account for was that I save everything. Every flagged transaction. Every note to self about a vendor I don't recognize. Every file I tell myself I'll circle back to. My dad raised me that way, not because he was paranoid, but because he respected the paper. He believed that if something was real, it deserved to be written down. If it mattered, it deserved a record. She built her plan on the assumption that grief would make me sloppy, that losing him would hollow me out enough that I'd miss things, or that I'd be too broken to fight. And I was broken. I won't romanticize it. There were weeks in there where I ran that company on 4 hours of sleep, and the kind of forward momentum that had nothing to do with hope and everything to do with not knowing what else to do with my hands. But I kept the files. Kyle made a different kind of mistake. He thought proximity to her plan made him smart. It made him liable. There's a version of him where he says no, where he tells his mother this has gone too far and walks away. I don't know if that version ever had a real chance, but the choice he made, to register that holding company, to put his name on the document that would have bought my father's company at a fraction of its worth, that choice had consequences that followed him out of the courtroom and into a prosecutor's office, and then into a plea agreement, and then into 3 years of proving he understands what he did. Actions have weight. That's not a religious idea. It's just physics. You do a thing, and the thing exists in the world, and eventually the world has to account for it. Diane spent 22 months moving money she hadn't earned. That money left a trail. The trail became 243 pages. The 243 pages became a judge asking a question no one in that room had a clean answer for. My father used to say the truth is patient. He meant it about business, about not cutting corners, about building the kind of reputation that takes years to earn and one bad decision to lose. But I think he was describing something bigger than he knew. I'm not the same person I was before any of this. I don't think you come through something like this unchanged, and I wouldn't trust anyone who said they did. But I know who I am now in a way I didn't before. I know what I'm willing to fight for. I know that staying quiet isn't the same as giving up. Sometimes it's the most powerful thing you can do, because it means you're building something they can't take apart. The photo is on my desk. My dad is laughing. I think he knew I'd be okay.